everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Relationships with Self and Other, Supporting Healthy Relationships and Self-Concept for Youth Impacted by Trafficking. This webinar is brought to you by the National Center on Child Trafficking. The NCCT is a national collaborative of professionals who are developing trauma-informed interventions and resources to improve the lives of children and families who are impacted by sex and labor trafficking. This is the 6th webinar in an 8-webinar series. The series reviews concepts from the NCCT's mental health treatment guidelines for youth who've experienced trafficking and/or commercial sexual exploitation. This graphic shows 10 central elements of trauma treatment when working with youth who've experienced trafficking. The mental health treatment guidelines offer recommendations in each area for treatment professionals. The last webinar shared guidance related to psychoeducation, and this webinar is going to focus on interpersonal relationships and self-concept. Trauma and trafficking profoundly impact a youth's ability to form and maintain healthy relationships. The treatment guidelines emphasize the need to collaborate with youth to identify and address those relational impacts. So today we're going to be discussing some therapeutic strategies to support the youth's capacity to establish secure and healthy connections within a number of different types of relationships. Our presenters are going to be touching on some of these themes that are named here, such as assertion of rights, conflict resolution, communication, boundary setting, trust. We're going to talk about how to support youth as they explore both the positive and the negative qualities in central relationships in their life, recognizing how some of those relational dynamics were important for survival, even as they might have contributed to trafficking, vulnerability, or other harms. The mental health treatment guidelines also emphasize the crucial role of strengthening the youth's self-concept, particularly given that the coercive, exploitive, and objectifying nature of trafficking can significantly disrupt or fragment self-concept. Our presenters today are going to explore how to help youth develop a more balanced and inclusive self-concept, one that integrates their past trauma, but also present strengths and challenges and future potential. So here's an overview of today's webinar. We're going to be talking about how interpersonal relationships and self-concept can be part of a cycle of vulnerability that can lead to trafficking. We'll talk about how the trafficking experience then cyclically impacts the youth's interpersonal relationships and their self-concept. And we'll be talking about clinical interventions focused on interpersonal relationships and self-concept. And then as we wrap up, I'll share a few additional resources to support you in this work. So we're really excited to welcome our presenters today. Antonia Barba is a licensed clinical social worker who specializes in affirming trauma-informed care for youth, young adults, and their families. She previously led a major SAMHSA initiative at the Jewish Board to improve care for transition-aged youth, including youth who've experienced commercial sexual exploitation. She's the founder of Inform Transform, where she provides consultation to practitioners and organizations on trauma-informed and family-centered best practices with at-risk youth. So we're really happy to have you here, Antonia. Thanks for joining us. And Ricardo Rubiales is a clinical social worker specializing in trauma and child welfare. As the director of Christie House Child Advocacy Center's Project Gold, he oversees and provides direct care, individual, family, and group services for youth, young adults, and families who've experienced or who are at risk of sex trafficking. And he's also co-developed the Bridges to the Future Education and Employment Program. So thanks for joining us, Ricardo. And we have Jennifer Roman Martin, who's a clinical social worker with expertise in the treatment of complex trauma across the lifespan. She's the project coordinator for the National Center on Child Trafficking, adjunct faculty at Boston College, and provides clinical services for youth and their caregivers impacted by trauma at Justice Resource Institute. So thanks for joining us, Jen. So I want to start us off with a little bit of a reflecting about why some of these topics are important. So let's start off with interpersonal relationships. And Ricardo, can you share a little bit with us about Why interpersonal relationships are so important in treatment with youth who've experienced trafficking?
Yeah, so many forms of trauma and abuse are interpersonal by their nature. Trafficking is interpersonal in multiple ways. There's different types of abuse that could occur as part of the trafficking. A lot of times when people think of sex trafficking, they just think of the sexually abusive parts of it. But ultimately, there are multi-layered abusive relationships and fundamentally exploitive relationships. There are vulnerabilities that we're going to talk about today that pre-exist the trafficking for many of the youth and young adults that we see in services. And a lot of times it goes back to upbringing, family dynamics, and we'll speak to those points. But ultimately, there's this wraparound effect of different types of relationships throughout the lifespan that create potential vulnerabilities and risk of trafficking. Ultimately, then the trafficking then impacts interpersonal relationships in the long term, in terms of how youth perceive themselves and how they perceive others, how they perceive relationships, and how they perceive the world. And we see that a lot, especially with those with complex trauma and more extensive histories of trauma, including but not limited to trafficking. At the same time, relationships, positive, pro-social, and supportive relationships can be a huge protective factor. These are things that could mediate the impacts and the detriment that occurs and the trauma that occurs as a result of trafficking by helping youth recognize the areas of relationships in their life that have been impacted by trafficking or that create vulnerabilities and risk factors, but also identify strong, positive relationships that could support them and be their resources going forward. Could be very instrumental to both clinical and non-clinical services and care.
Great. And Antonia, what about self-concept? Why does that matter in treatment with youth who've experienced trafficking?
Sure. Well, as Ricardo was sharing, I think about how, the roots and the origins and children's experiences of growing up and developing a sense of self and self-concept is, the work of childhood development. It starts at a very early age. It's very much grounded in circumstances, in context, in culture, expectations, and families. And so, when we think about how that can contribute to vulnerabilities, ideally every child would have, a healthy, supportive place where they're getting a lot of positive validation and lots of freedom and room for exploration and trying things and getting a lot of, support through that process. But when we think about kids who have have a history of different kinds of trauma experiences, and I'm thinking, things that are related to, rejecting experiences related to aspects of their identity, but also those experiences that happen in the home, domestic violence, exposure to interpersonal violence and different forms of child abuse and maltreatment. And how those are happening in the context of a relationship with a caregiver, someone, a trusted adult that they are looking up to. And the way that, those, the messages, the negative kinds of messages, the overt traumas, the underlying messages are all being internalized, particularly when young people are experiencing those across multiple domains in their life. And so that can really, I think, obviously impact their developmental trajectory and their sense of self is really shaped and informed by these experiences. And so young people who, don't have a healthy sense of self, whose, sense of their self-concept has already been impacted by trauma earlier in their childhood or in other, times in their life, who become really vulnerable to trafficking because of that. And those kinds of experiences get compounded by the traumas associated with trafficking. They're, the avenues that are available to them in terms of their, self-expression and development can really be stunted, can be suppressed, can be limited, can be minimized. And certainly the nature, the kind of exploitative, coercive nature of trafficking, the objectification really kind of like falls into those same grooves and patterns that have already been set. And so that continues to really disrupt and shape and limit the way that a young person develops their sense of self concept, their, sense of self-worth, their self-efficacy, a lot of really negative messages become internalized, which make it really hard for them to break out of these situations, to see themselves as worthy and deserving of love and support. And so in terms of how we're thinking about approaching this, we want to, think about how we can develop, speak to some of these deficits that they've experienced. How can we cultivate a sense of self-compassion and understanding and meaning making? Where are there seeds that we can plant to really support healing and address some of those gaps in development? How can we help, a young person, focus on their sense of self in a more positive way, kind of flipping and turning some of their experiences inside out. And we'll talk more about ways to do that, so that we're really reflecting back, like, their strengths, their interests, things that are fun, the resilience, the resourcefulness that they've had to cultivate. How can we, think about supporting their autonomy, their choice, and really honoring their priorities and what's important to them, helping them to feel heard and to, move along those paths that are important to them. I think can really help to address some of the ways that self-concept can be really negatively impacted.
That's great. Thank you. And, we chose to do this webinar with these two ideas together, these two concepts together, because of how interrelated they are. Jen, do you want to talk a little bit about how they interact among youth impacted by trafficking?
Yeah, I'd love to. So thanks, Elise, and it's great to be with Antonia and Ricardo today. I always think it's such a special place when we have these providers doing awesome work across the country, sharing recommendations moving forward. But when we talk about these two areas, what we really hear is that it can be helpful to think about them as almost a two-way street or a bidirectional relationship. So if a young person has a negative self-concept, it can make them more vulnerable in their relationships and more likely to engage in unhealthy interpersonal relationships. But it can also we see it going the other way. So those early experiences in unhealthy or abusive relationships can actually grow these negative beliefs youth hold about themselves and the world, and then can create this cycle where they might be more vulnerable to manipulation or coercion later on. And I also think about this intersection not in vulnerability pathways, but also post-trafficking. So yeah, afterwards, if youth are after their trafficking experience, we might also see these relational dynamics or the impact of the self-concept stuff repeat. So youth might find themselves with a negative sense of self or in a new relationship to them that feels better than their trafficking situation, but there might be major power imbalances that kind of perpetuate or continue this cycle. And we also see the impact of that commodification that comes into play when we think about self-concept and interpersonal relationships after trafficking. So exchanges in trafficking can impact how youth experiencing themselves and in the world, and can lead both to a commodified view of self, but also a transactional view of relationships, where they sense, rightly so, because of their experiences, that relationships are transactional, that someone wants something from them, which can be particularly salient and important when we're talking about in the therapeutic space. And these relationships, they might view relationships as based in exchanges as coercion, which impact their expectations of other people in the future. And we'll talk a little bit more about what we do with that and the impact of trafficking throughout our time today, and how we address that in the clinical space.
Great, thank you. That gives us a good sense of where we're going to get to. Let's dive in a little bit more into that vulnerability factors, that how do interpersonal relationships and self-concept create vulnerability to trafficking later on. So Ricardo, do you want to start us off in talking a little bit about interpersonal relationships there as a vulnerability factor?
Yeah, and when considering what someone who experiences trafficking has been through, it's really important to consider the whole human and conceptualize their lifespan leading up to that, especially when we consider that there were vulnerabilities and past experiences that opened up the opportunity for them to experience trafficking. In terms of intergenerational trauma, a lot of times individuals have experienced by witnessing, hearing about, or even themselves being victims of, when it's occurring in the home, different types of trauma. And you're going to hear me frame it this way a lot of times because I think it's important, especially for those who are less experienced or not experienced in working with individuals that have experienced trafficking, that a lot of the things that you may see with different types of trauma and abuse that you may be more familiar with overlaps. And so it's not this like we in preparing for this presentation, we talked about that there could be a Venn diagram of these things, right? So I want to speak to these things in a way that's relatable. So if you have someone who has experienced, let's say, physical abuse, emotional abuse, sexual abuse, domestic violence, and by experience, I'm going to use that term loosely. That includes, again, witnessing or just hearing about it around them. There's going to be a normalization of these things sometimes. There's going to be the perception that these things are common, and maybe even expected. Okay. And, the next bullet points speak to that a little bit more. But when it comes to someone being potentially groomed and trafficked, if their awareness is that these are things that have been ongoing for throughout their lifespan, but throughout generations within their family or the people around them, then it really does create this normalization of violence. Um, uh, the media plays a huge factor in these things too. So, moving on to the normalization of violence more broadly, we live in a world where everything is online, everything is on TV, everything is streamable. Um, Youth are exposed in the news and through really inaccurate and incomplete accounts and reels and images online and especially on social media. Um, about how violence in relationships could be not only something expected, but normal. Something that, we see, there's an ongoing pandemic of victim blaming when we see something online, and then people question, what did that person do to put themselves in that situation, right? And as advocates and clinicians working this world, we have to consider that victim blaming that sometimes gets integrated and normalizes the trauma, the abuse, and exposure to these things, including trafficking. A lot of the youth moving on to patterns in relationships, we have a lot of individuals that have experienced trafficking that have histories of bullying, for example. And a lot of times we think of bullying as a neighborhood thing or a school thing, but bullying could happen within the family. A lot of times things that maybe don't even rise to the level of emotional or physical abuse in the home, are forms of bullying, even if it's just between siblings or cousins or similar age peers, right? And then so what we see a lot is that youth develop patterns of seeking out people with certain relational dynamics, maybe because that person presents with a certain aura or confidence, or those are the individuals that get what they want. Those are the individuals who seem to be the ones that if you get along with them and are engaged with them, you might even get a sense of power, while there might be in reality coercion of yourself in that process. And so when you have these layers building up from intergenerational trauma, what they're exposed to in the home, in the community, and online, and then already having patterns in relationships that are disrupted by these experiences, and mimic or are in fact abusive in some nature, there could develop this expectation of mistreatment. The earlier and abusive relationships can create an expectation of this, and negative beliefs about themselves, which is why we're combining this with self-concept, but beliefs about others, which increase vulnerabilities. Some of us, when we do trainings, we talk about like the extremes. You don't want a youth to feel like they should trust everyone. That would be risky and unhealthy and unsafe. But feeling like you cannot trust anybody creates a huge vulnerability through the isolation, and then that random person that, for whatever reason, presents themselves as a way to not be isolated could take advantage of that. And that's where grooming comes into play. Youth may perceive traffickers or abusers as a source of positive support, a source of reliability when other relationships have been unreliable, um, a relationship that's trustworthy, and honest when they've been deceived or hurt by people throughout their lifespan. These things build a sense of reliability and dependability that makes someone very vulnerable to trafficking and other forms of abuse. And what we often see is that abusers and traffickers and exploiters often see, what is this individual missing in their life that they could try and manipulate or utilize to get this person to trust them more, be with them more, maybe isolate from others and trust others less. Ultimately, it wraps around this developmental need for belonging. I think that every human has some sense of wanting to be a part of something. What that looks like and what that is could vary greatly. But if you have a lot of examples or a pervasive, consistent example of not belonging, you're still going to have that desire, that natural craving. And unfortunately, with how grooming and manipulation works, and that exploiters and abusers can see that from miles away and take advantage of it, it creates a huge vulnerability when there's someone who, even if the trafficker, abuser, exploiter doesn't realize it until the person starts sharing things with them, a lot of times they pick up very quickly on that this youth needs something. And that's why a lot of times we talk about vulnerabilities as being pretty broad. A vulnerability could just be hunger or needing a place to stay. But at the very, very fundamental nature is us as humans, there's a wanting to belong, to be cared for and supportive and to feel valued. And that's what we're going to speak to these areas in further detail in the slides ahead.
So that the youth who really are having that missing piece in terms of what they've gotten from relationships, and what they're needing, and something that puts them at risk for sure. What about self-concept, Antonia?
Yeah. Well, and as Ricardo was sharing, I was really thinking about how just interconnected these pieces are. In particular, the need for belonging. And so it's really important to think about, again, the influence of environment, circumstances, context, the amount, the possibility models that exist or don't, right? Representation, how they see themselves reflected back in the world around them, whether or not they're receiving affirmation and support in who they are, and where that is and isn't available in their lives is such an important factor to consider. Because it shapes that young person's sense of self based on what they're experiencing in their interpersonal relationships, what's being reflected back to them, and how normalized these kinds of reactions and responses are. And so for young people who are being exposed to a lot of abusive and neglectful environments, where the relationships that they have with the people in those environments, particularly caregivers, family members, supportive adults, when they are dependent on them, look up to them, feel connected and love and longing for them. All of those things can really contribute to a young person's vulnerability if they're not getting that kind of support and affirmation, particularly when it's not happening anywhere, right? And kind of naming all of those domains, right? What may be happening in their home and in their peer relationships, at school, in the community, and then in the larger kind of society. What are they seeing reflected back? And that's connected to, how safe is it for them to explore and, figure out who they are and receive positive messages and support in response to that. And I think this, a particular vulnerability for any young people who have, aspects of their identities that are marginalized, minoritized, that are not more broadly represented, where there is harmful and hateful rhetoric that's very present, and that's being reflected back again kind of on a social scale and in all of the relationships in their lives. And so again, like that desire to belong and to fit in doesn't go away. Young people are by nature, again, this is the work of childhood, is developing, exploring, figuring out who they are. And so if there are no safe places or people in their lives that will support that, they're going to seek them out. And so that might be, moving into more adult spaces and relationships, right? Because it's not in any of the normal spaces in their lives. Certainly we know that young people who are experiencing isolation and marginalization can spend a lot of time online, trying to connect and build community there. And as Ricardo pointed out, so many exploiters are aware of that, are looking for those kinds of opportunities to, to connect with young people who don't have that safe place to explore. It may be that young people only see like hope of possibility for them is something that is connected to to sex work, to to commodification of their bodies, that is like a means to an end, that is all that is available to them. And so, that's the only path that feels available to them, because no one is, sharing or giving them examples of that happening otherwise. And so I think another thing that certainly can happen, particularly when young people are not able to safely explore, to express themselves, that if they are finding that in relationship to their exploiters in that situation, they may actually, for the first time in the context of those relationships, have a sense of affirmation, right? That experience of being desired and affirmed for who they are, in relation to being their relationship with their exploiter. And so, that can override, any of the fears, worries, discomforts that may be associated with that, because that feeling of like, oh, I was seen, someone, related to me in a way that felt really good, and I haven't experienced that anywhere else in my life, is a really powerful thing. That can, and make, wanting more of that to happen. And so I think also in terms of like just thinking about the nature of relationships and hierarchy and trafficking and the commodification aspect of it also, for a young person who's internalized a lot of really negative messages about themselves and feeling worthless, feeling like there is something wrong with them, that they are other, that they are less than, that even the smallest amount of validation around, whether that's like being a big earner, having some kind of like leadership role, the strength of being able to carry all of these things in their lives. Again, those feelings are so powerful and can really pull kids into, even draw them even deeper into this experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think, recognizing that the ways that the experience of trafficking or exploitation is meeting some of those needs is really important for us. And, the vulnerabilities that kids come in with, they have some positives that they get out of that situation. Now, unfortunately, it tends to be cyclical, and that there is then an impact of the trafficking or exploitation back onto their relationships and back onto their self-concept. So, Jen, can you talk a little bit about this, about starting off with interpersonal relationships and just how that can be affected by the experience of trafficking?
Yeah, so kind of digging into how the impact, I think broadly speaking, one of the themes we might see is this transactional nature of interactions. For some youth, transactional relationships can also actually feel safer because the boundaries and expectations are very clear. So, if I've lived in a world where closeness is paired with potential harm, then my body might feel actually safer and with really clear expectations and boundaries as a way to control any potential harm. And while boundaries that might result from a trafficking experience might not be expectations that are healthy, might be the predictability, can be something that youth are looking for. So this is kind of why boundaries in the therapeutic space can be so essential with youth impacted by trafficking. National Center on Child Trafficking, got to give a plug. We dive a little bit more into this into the previous webinar series in the series on therapeutic relationship. And with these explicitly transactional relationships, there can be less of that messy emotional vulnerability, and vulnerability can feel scary or threatening sometimes. They might even feel a sense of agency, like I'm not a victim, I was the one in charge here. Maybe there's other people on the call today that are relating to doing like a safe, calm space activity with a youth and then feeling like, whoa, that actually brought a lot of big feelings and a triggered reaction, because calm and safe feels very foreign and like when harm comes in. We also might think about experiences of trafficking indirectly contributing to later re-victimization. So this experience of trafficking, as well as, as Ricardo was talking about, this preceding developmental trauma that might have happened before, this harm might become normalized to a point where later on, even post-trafficking, youth might be in abusive relationships that might be perceived as the best treatment they've ever received in a relationship. And this might actually be the case for some youth, which is really painful to recognize, but also because there's just can be distorted expectations of what is acceptable and what is healthy in relationships. So kind of given these broad themes, let's think a little bit more about the impact of trafficking on these different types of relationships. So as providers, we might experience some countertransference. Youth comes in talking about their exploiter, and as a provider, I might feel like this is bad, right? The exploiter is bad. But this can also be a really tricky since the situation, since many youth, as Antonio was talking about, may understandably have mixed emotions around these people and relationships. Youth might feel a lot of conflicting emotions. They might feel like this relationship filled a void or met basic needs for safety or affection, or gave me a sense of belonging or protection that I didn't have beforehand. It can also be something about being valued. Sometimes the act of being wanted or valued by someone else becomes value in and of itself, particularly if youth haven't had that experience beforehand. We'll also kind of explore the relationship with exploiters on the upcoming webinar on trauma experience integration. So I encourage you to check out that as well, because I think this is a really common theme that comes up that I think we could spend 3 more webinars unpacking. Romantic relationships can also be impacted. Trafficking can kind of distort what romance looks like, particularly in sex trafficking, which might lead to hypervigilance or total indifference to danger, meaning that youth might feel avoidant or under concerned about any potential red flags, which can bring up big feelings for us as providers that might feel the urge to protect. There also might be there's also a couple resources that we'll talk about at the end of the webinar today, talking about healthy romantic relationships and that intersection of sexual health and trauma, like trafficking, which can be really tricky. With peers, there can be relational anxiety, social withdrawal. Youth might experience bullying or a sense of not belonging among peers, particularly around those who don't have similar life experiences, which might contribute to re-victimization or that cyclical nature of trafficking and looking for a sense of belonging. So like Antonio was talking about, this normal development need to belong, along with that sense of alienation, can be a real vulnerability towards re-victimization. And on the contrary, youth might be more people-pleasing or have a lack of boundaries because of what they've experienced. With work and school, unfortunately, it's a lot of mandatory things that have to be done, whether it's going to school or going to your job. And also in this inherent differential of power, this imbalance. So these power dynamics with people and teachers and bosses can be incredibly triggering for youth at baseline, but particularly youth who've experienced trafficking, because these relationships aren't optional. There is a real power differential here, and there's very real impact about the decisions or conclusions that teachers or bosses or staff have on their life. Youth are often particularly in teenagehood or late adolescence, are in this developmental stage where they're learning to receive feedback as well as assert themselves at baseline. And then an experience of trafficking in your past can really understandably make this learning process even trickier and bring about big feelings and big behaviors, particularly if a youth feels like I'm getting controlled all over again. And last but certainly not least, this when we think about family and children, it's so complex. Caregiver involvement is certainly a component of treatment that we delve into in the Connection is Key webinar with Jihan Omar and Don Blacker earlier this year. But we talk a little bit extensively about the role of caregiving and support of adults and youth mental health treatment. But also beyond relationship with caregivers or parents, youth's relationships with siblings can be impacted. Everyone in the family has their own individual experience in the family system of the trafficking occurring, how they learned about the trafficking, the impact of the trafficking, and the response. And there can be shifts in these relationship dynamics. And youth themselves might also be parents, which can add a layer of vulnerability as they figure out this new role as a parent themselves, and can be further complicated because children sometimes can be conceived within an experience of trafficking. And so in that way, the experience is still living with them on an ongoing basis.
Thanks, Jen. And what about self-concept, Ricardo?
Yeah, and I think, again, to make this as relatable as possible, let's pause for a second, remove trafficking off the table. Forgive me just for a split second, pivoting from trafficking.
I appreciate that,
When
Ricardo.
someone is young and developing, they lack self-awareness. They're developing a sense of self-efficacy, and they're figuring out who they are, and they're integrating into who they are, who they want to be. This is baseline. So when you're talking about children and adolescents, this is the baseline. These are already muddy and confusing waters. And I think that most people, not everyone who's in the audience here, and I could say for sure for many of us presenters, if not all of us, struggle with these things throughout adolescence. And if you really think about it, we struggle that into our 20s, and then we reinvent ourselves in our 30s, and so on and so forth. So the baseline is that we spent a lot of life trying to figure out who we are, develop our self-awareness skills, and develop our sense of self-esteem and self-efficacy. Now you add trauma, more complex trauma, and in particular, if you add in trafficking, these things have gotten multiple pinpricks into something that was already amorphous and fluid to begin with, because that's part of our development naturally at baseline. So let's talk about self-awareness for a second. So the loss of internal cues, okay? A lot of times, youth who have experienced trafficking have lost their, we talk about a lot. I'm going to pivot here again. We talk a lot about the difference between the brain and the body and how these things are impacted by trauma in a way that we didn't talk about many decades ago, right? Um, Being able to have a sense of what we're feeling is already challenging for youth who are developing a sense of being able to identify feelings. They're not usually very connected to their bodies, right? When you add into that they have experiences where these things have become confusing and coerced, manipulated, abused, controlled, it can be extra confusing. And when you add that in layers into that of, you know, you of not knowing the difference between what may be excitement or attraction compared to what might be your amygdala or red flags happening. And I think most of you, if you're in the trauma world, right, you've probably seen memes and reels increasing about this in recent years on social media about like, do I really like them or am I feeling red flags, or am I seeing warning signs? So this could be particularly challenging for youth who are, having had so many experiences where excitement has bordered on good things, like riding a roller coaster, and excitement has also been part of something that could be abusive or manipulative or toxic, including but not limited to trafficking, right? And so that makes it extra challenging and confusing for youth to be able to discern their internal cues. Because as we're developing, there are so many experiences, good and bad, that we end up in because it's what we think we're supposed to do. Through peer pressure, our family members make us do things we don't want to do. And this doesn't mean something harmful or at risk even. You get nervous before taking a test. These feelings could get very mixed up, and being able to then have this like heightened sense of what those feelings are and what they mean as pertaining to your self-concept when you've also experienced trafficking and have those cues played around with and manipulated even more could be really, really, really difficult. In addition to that, in terms of our self-awareness, is we see a lot with people who've experienced trauma, the people pleasing. You see more and more nowadays when instead of just saying fight, flight, and freeze, people are including fawn, right? As in the F's that are responses to trauma. And what we see is a lot of youth who have felt like they disappointed others, felt like they weren't good enough. Their self-concept, their self-efficacy is low and being negative impacted by their, lifetime of traumas and especially trafficking. And they may very much, either because of their need to survive by pleasing abusers and exploiters, okay, and doing what needs to be done to survive in that setting, or just to want to make someone happy because past relationships have been marred by just disappointment and hurt. You know, there's a huge layer of loss in one's self-concept when making other people happy or prioritizing other people's needs becomes, what you're aiming for and what you need to do to get by, versus also taking care of yourself. Okay. And then also there's an interference in terms of self-awareness with exploring the world. A lot of times youth who have experienced trafficking and other forms of trauma have had limited experiences. You sometimes hear expressions like, I never really had my childhood. It's something that you hear commonly. I really didn't get to be a kid. I really didn't get to be a teenager. And there are these added pinpricks to one's self-concept when you haven't even been able to explore what you, as yourself, for yourself, would want to explore, would want to try to enjoy, to be able to figure out, do I like this or do I not like this? When you're manipulated into situations where you have to like or pretend to like or dislike certain things in order to get by or to make someone happy or because it's part of the exploitative experience. All this ties into self-efficacy, which is, if I can't figure out what these feelings inside me are telling me, and my priority is to please others, and I haven't had the chance to explore and enjoy what are the things that really make me me. Okay. How am I supposed to have, on top of what we already established as a baseline nebulous self-efficacy and self-esteem, how am I supposed to develop a sense of self-efficacy in those contexts? You know, and we have other layers like self-integration where, having a coherent sense of one's self gets challenged. If I'm always responding to feelings in my body that I'm not even fully grasping, if exploitation and manipulation involve coercion, if I'm people pleasing, if and prioritizing others, who am I really? And I didn't get to explore the things, all this stuff layers in, right? I didn't get to explore and enjoy the things I really like and figure out what I like and don't like and have those experiences. How am I supposed to have a true sense of myself and who I am and what I'm supposed to be doing? You know, a lot of times there's dissonance that is a result of being coerced or rewarded for these things. Okay. We know, and again, I'm trying to broaden it so it's relatable to folks beyond trafficking with different forms of trauma. We see a lot of times there's shame and ambivalence related to different forms of abuse and different forms of trauma. And, a lot of times trafficking, like as we've discussed already, it envelops so many of these things. It's almost like sometimes it could be like trauma on steroids, or what you might more commonly refer to as just complex trauma, but it's almost oversimplistic to view it that way. And so those layers of shame and confusion, loss of self, loss of what you thought you were, what you thought could have been, or the way things were supposed to be, the relationships that have been lost and damaged, and still having loving or positive experiences or care, for people who haven't been involved in the abuse or the trafficking and exploitation could really be confusing. And then throughout all that, to survive, you're code switching between who you are at school to please the teachers and your peers, who you are at home to please the family members and whoever's in the family unit, who you are in the neighborhood to survive the neighborhood, who you are with exploiters or traffickers or other types of abusers to get by in those situations. This could really cause havoc in one's ability to realize, who am I really?
Yeah, absolutely. That self-awareness and kind of being able to pull all those pieces together. Do you want to add a little bit more about self-concept, Antonia?
Sure. Just a couple of, this quote feels so powerful. The youth may believe that their value is connected with how much money or how many goods they can attain. In the context of everything that we've been talking about, the nature of these relationships is so exploitative, is so transactional. And again, if we're like placing this in the context of a young person's life where this has been like the only or the primary, the source of most kind of validation, affirmation, recognition, the first person kind of showing them care or protectiveness, it becomes like they're this like shaping, defining experience, right? The only time if I've only ever experienced affirmation and appreciation and gratitude in the context of how much money I've been able to make in a night, right? That like starts to that becomes like my metric for how I view myself. And so a lot of those, hearing young people say things like people, I will only take care of me if I'm able to make money for them. I think about this too in the context of their family lives and, expectations around finances and contributing to the household. And again, like having a sense of pride and value and worth that they're able to do that. I've heard that also the way that kind of transcends, beyond that experience, working a lot in residential care. I can't tell you how many times I've heard young people say, to the staff that are are there to support them. Like, you are only here for the check. You would not be taking care of me otherwise. So that, it's connected to their own sense of self-worth, but again, also how they're perceiving, other people and their value in relation to those others. So, without that money, being a primary motivator or factor, there's no reason, that child is not deserving of anyone, protecting them, caring for them, investing in them. And so, of course, that gets internalized. I think also the loss of their core sense of self. Their all of, any kind of previous experiences, their interests, being involved in like normal kid things, playing, athletics, clubs, relationship building, dating relationships, peer relationships, often have been so significantly limited by these types of experiences. Those are things that are that they are now cut off from, or like a fantasy past life, or again, like those are for other kids, for other people, not something that is possible for me because of the experiences. Like, why bother investing in those things or spending my time? They have no value, they have no worth, they will not benefit me in any kind of way. Also, the impact that it has on, like we talked a lot about shame and how that gets internalized, how these kinds of exploitative, abusive, demeaning, and sometimes violent experiences can really cause a lot of shame and self-judgment. Dissociation, detachment from body, right? Like body being a commodity, something that has a particular value or worth to others, but not something that is belonging to them, that they can be proud of, feel good about, feeling good in your body. Again, that kind of detachment or, depersonalization, desensitivity is also a survival and a coping strategy, right? To kind of disconnect, dissociate from body in order to survive these experiences. And so that becomes a norm and a pattern. But I think this can all be reinforced by all different kinds of external stigma. And so like those negative messages that add to self-blame, whether that's coming from an exploiter, from peers, from family members, just those, feelings of, or messages around, this is all that you're good for. No one will ever love you. Those kinds of things that young people experience, can exacerbate all of these other things. This is all feels very interconnected in terms of kids and young people feeling like they have access to possibilities and they can move into things that are pleasurable and enjoyment and exploration, because, all of those avenues feel so limited by these, by trafficking and other kinds of trauma experiences, and also by the ways that, we as providers and society and systems are reacting and responding to them can often really reinforce those negative messages. And so also thinking about, how this contributes to like future possibility, future self. We know that when we are in the midst of trauma and certainly experiencing, pervasive trauma that is, in just about every aspect of life, we're focused on our day-to-day survival, keeping things going. I've talked with so many young people who talk about the fatigue, the exhaustion, a sense of, living this double life. And they're really just focused on, the immediate survival. That's not a place where we can envision wonderful things for ourselves. That is not a place where you have the capacity, the emotional energy to do a lot of long-term goal setting and future planning. And certainly those things are not reinforced by the circumstances they're in. And so if you don't have a sense of, control over your life, you're just kind of surviving from day to day. Of course, it makes sense that we lose a sense of hope, a sense of purpose, right? There's this one, sole purpose, dominating purpose. And so, sorry, I lost my train of thought. I want to make sure I'm saying everything I wanted to share. But I want to say too, like that sense even of having to start over can feel huge and impossible and overwhelming, right? If this is all that someone has known and there are so many ingrained patterns. how does one even begin to start over? How do you envision, this idea, I think, of recovery too can be really difficult if you've always kind of been in a place of experiencing this, recover to what? There is no kind of baseline or previous to return to. It all can feel so much like uncharted territory. And so that's where I think about, how can we, again, kind of like flip some of these experiences inside out and really reflect back, do a lot of reframing and just validating, right, of the kinds of choices that young people have made, are, how they kept themselves safe and alive, how they were navigating these really intensely complex situations that as adults we would struggle to know what to do best with. And they did it as a youngster with very few resources. They did it alone, and like what tremendous strength and resilience, where they've demonstrated leadership qualities, creativity, innovation, tenacity. Those are things that we can really validate and highlight, and hopefully we'll like use those as those kind of motivation sparks for keeping young people open to future possibilities.
I love that. And it's that balance between recognizing all of the negative impacts here, but also what does that mean for us in terms of being able to understand and join with the youth, but also to recognize what do they need now from intervention? How can therapy be helpful in moving them forward? And part of it is seeing those possibilities in them.
And so just to do a quick sum up of, what we've been talking about in terms of the impact of trafficking, some key takeaways that we want to think about especially as we move into our clinical interventions and, what do we do with this? Just understanding that transactional view of relationships that has been internalized. The normalization of harm, certainly like kids are often not naming these experiences as traumatic or anything outside of the expected norms. The suppression of internal cues, right? That awareness, being able to gauge situations, to trust your sense of self and those warning signs and red flags. That fragmentation, having to break off pieces, and compartmentalize self to be able to function and survive across all of these challenging situations. And an internalized sense of shame and diminished self-worth that can result from the accumulation of these experiences.
Great. So, Antonio, let's go ahead and dive into that a little bit more. How does this understanding lead to the recommendations for clinical interventions? How can we support these youth in developing healthy relationships and a positive sense of self?
Yeah, this is where I think as a practitioner, as a supervisor, as someone who's a lot of the work that I've done has been in the context of like some group programming and community building in the context of the work that we're doing. I bring a lot of like my best motivational interviewing self, a lot of non-judgment and respect of autonomy, a lot of respectful curiosity. And so, a lot of curiosity in particular about like what are, wanting to learn about their significant relationships across, their family, their peers, partners, people they're involved with, their exploiters, staff in the programs, right? The people that are in their sphere and in their lives. And in that, I have a lot of curiosity around, what kinds of expectations and messages have they received from all of these people around their identity and their expression, who they are. What kinds of expectations also have been communicated around finances and money, because often those messages are really strong and set expectations, and can be reinforced in these patterns. I'm curious about like, how do you communicate with these folks? How do you manage and resolve conflicts? Like, what does that look like? How do you address that? What do these conversations look like if you're having them at all? And again, across all of these different types of relationships, just lots of curiosity and wanting to learn about what these experiences have been like for them. I think also having to kind of sit in this space, which I think can be really challenging as a provider, where we see that this is an unsafe or a dangerous relationship, that there is harm that's being caused. to not, to resist the urge to, make them see things in a particular way, to dissuade them from being involved in these relationships and circumstances, that we really have to validate the gains, right? The benefits of being involved in these relationships, and balancing that, right? So, I always think about like how I can validate emotions, I can validate the way an experience made someone feel, but that doesn't mean that I'm endorsing or condoning it, right? I'm reflecting my understanding. And I think particularly when young people have been, especially young people who've been so systems involved and are so savvy, they have our number. They've heard all the do's and don'ts and the tip sheets. And so just really being able to like sit with them and not judge them or try to talk them out of or sway them in a particular way, right? I'm sitting on my hands and not bringing what I want the outcome to be, but really kind of sitting with them and learning where they're coming from and offering that like alternate or balanced perspective. So a lot of like the kind of both and, right? Like, wow, so like this person is like the first, he was the first person in your life who really like you felt like he saw you for who you were. He learned about the things that you loved and cared about and took an interest in you. And, on the other hand, there are also some, situations that have come up where you're not feeling as safe and supported as you once were, or where you're not able to explore and move forward with some of the things that you've really been wanting to do. You are feeling stuck, right? So just, kind of naming that both of these things are coexisting, for folks who know motivational interviewing, right? Developing the discrepancy, but always like mirroring them in terms of their language and their words and really being mindful of not bringing any kind of judgmental language into, what I'm doing, or into the way that I'm talking about it with them. We do a way to kind of one activity or strategy. There's a lot of kind of fun ways also. I don't know if fun is exactly the word, but creative ways to approach this. And so using like a social support map, with concentric circles with that young person at the center, to learn about, again, the relationships and what trust and boundaries look like in relationships for them. So, having them map out, who are the people that are involved in their lives and how close do you feel to them, and then inquiring, having a conversation as we're looking at this map, like, why is this person, tell me a little bit more about them. How did they come to be so close to you in the circle? How do you, how can you, uh, how do you develop a sense of trust with them, or how did you develop a sense of trust? Why would you place someone kind of further out in your map? Tell me more about them. Are there ways that are there times that you've moved people farther back? Why? What did they do? What happened, right? What caused you to make that decision? Just a lot of inquiry, or using like a trust continuum, right? With like, without question, 100% trust this person on one end of, trust people on this end of the spectrum, and like absolutely not, like so skeptical, and then placing people on that continuum, the people that are in their lives, and having conversations about, again, how do you know when you can trust someone? Has there been a time that you thought you could trust someone and it turned out that you couldn't? Could we talk about that? Really just asking for, for examples of what that has looked like, to help kind of differentiate the different types of relationships that they have. This is where I think also doing these activities sometimes in groups can be helpful as like a supplement. I think when preparing for this, one of the things that we talked about, I have, and I think Ricardo also has been trained in the Love 146, not a number model that has a lot of really cool activities and games, discussion starters that are focused on, group education and prompting conversation around healthy relationships, and really doing it again in a non-judgmental way that invites exploration. And so sometimes that can happen through, sharing scenarios, right? We're not going to start by talking about your relationships and your life first. We'll talk about some kind of hypothetical examples, or name different characteristics of relationships. and invite them to reflect on whether or not that seems like a sign of a healthy relationship or an unhealthy relationship. Where is their ambivalence? I'm not sure. Maybe that's a red flag. Let's talk about, again, how we're making decisions about who we're in relationship with, where, there might be difference of opinion around what constitutes healthy or unhealthy. I've had some really great experiences, having these conversations together with young people, and and then having them talk about this in the group, and then that being something that we can follow up on in individual treatment. I think the last point about clarifying values is just around, that baseline of, when they are in a calm place, not an agitated place. But, like talking about, again, like what are their deal breakers in relationships? What are the things that they like in relationships? And what are the things that, that they absolutely won't stand? And how have they handled those situations when they've encountered them before? Or how might they handle them in the future? Sorry, I just wanted to make sure to include that. Okay. And as Ricardo and others have made the point, we're talking about we're focused on trafficking, but also really thinking about complex trauma. And I want to acknowledge here that, when we're providing, psychoeducation and information specifically about trauma, that the trauma of trafficking might not be something that they acknowledge as trauma, might not be their priority. And so we really want to focus on the things that matter most to them. So, thinking about different kinds of tools that we can have to talk about trauma, sometimes using the term like stressful situations, challenges, if they're not associating with the word trauma, but, really talking about how their past experiences, their traumas and exploitation experiences have impacted their ability to develop trust. Using the power and control wheel as an example, to kind of break this out and talk about different characteristics of relationships, and thinking about healthy and unhealthy relationships on a spectrum. Talking about, intimacy versus transaction, right? The difference between, real true intimacy and what they envision for relationships, ideal relationships, their relationships goals, examples that they've seen of that, and more transactional experiences that they've had. And this is also, as folks have been naming, really validating any kind of those like survival-based patterns. Are there patterns that they've experienced in relationships, people pleasing, isolating, where there's been a seeking control or validation that has shown up repeatedly in the relationships that they've had, and really again validating that helped them to survive really terrible circumstances. It met their attachment needs. But that these methods might not be necessary anymore. They might not be helpful. There might be really negative consequences attached to that. And I would say overall, with all of these things, it's not about convincing them or getting them to admit or agree to the fact that this is a coercive or exploitative relationship or circumstance, that it's abusive. We're not challenging them. We're really helping them to identify those patterns and want to make those connections. It's not about convincing them that they're a victim, but really helping them to put this together in a way that feels meaningful to them.
All right, and Tonya did such a robust and comprehensive job there. She made my life a lot easier here. So I'm going to avoid possible redundancies. Could we move on to the next slide, please? All right. So, in terms of clinical interventions and boundaries, a lot of times we hyper focus on, substance use, sexual boundaries, and like personal space and things like that. And I think there's a lot of other layers that we could consider when addressing boundaries and helping someone develop and understand boundaries for themselves. And again, an overall, overlapping thing between relationships and self-concept. Our relationship as clinicians can establish the ability for someone develop their self-concept in terms of boundaries just by us having boundaries in the therapy space whether it's individual therapy, family therapy, group therapy, in those sorts of areas, us having some basic boundaries. That doesn't mean being overly rigid, you know. I don't find that youth who have experienced trafficking respond very well to like a white lab coat and, a sterile environment, and it to be overly clinical in the way that clinical could be not necessarily a good thing, right? And I think there's opportunities to hear their voice in what they've experienced, how they perceive it. Antonia spoke a few times about curiosity and non-judgment. And I want to double, triple, quadruple down on that, establishing that they could come in and that you want to get to understand them in a way that probably no one has, except unfortunately, maybe they're abusers or traffickers, you know? And so there's a big layer of having to being able to create different experiences than what they've experienced in their trauma and trafficking. That could include in clinical work with us individually. Antonia referred to groups, and that's a really important thing I'm going to touch back on. However, even in treatment planning and getting to know the individual, what are other settings where they can learn to develop boundaries, not just in school, not just in therapy, and not just regarding unhealthy relationships? I think we often make a mistake of hyper focusing on the trauma, trafficking, or otherwise, and the symptoms that might qualify for whatever diagnosis. But being able to be person centered and strength based is really important because it's going to matter a lot to the youth to be able to establish a boundary, such as being able to express to a family member, as simple as, I really don't want to watch that movie. Can we watch a different movie? To create a different experience. And if we are doing family therapy, because the therapy work isn't always individual, being able to facilitate those sorts of conversations, different types of boundaries that go beyond just abuse or high risk behaviors. Okay. A lot of times again, when it comes to sex trafficking in particular, people focus on the sexual abuse aspect of it. But as I mentioned before, there are physical and emotional abusive aspects, and people don't talk enough about financial abuse. And so I work with a lot of youth that have dealt with the sexual trauma and the trafficking, maybe successfully completed therapy, maybe they're doing okay, but they still end up in manipulative or unhealthy relationships, even if they don't quantify to abusive, and in particular, financially abusive relationships. If you all are working with individuals who've experienced trafficking and just generally speaking complex trauma, have in mind that there are very poor financial boundaries, and that is often what results in someone being re-victimized, even if not in the form of trafficking. Okay. We want to have them practice. Always make clinical stuff fun. Use examples, use role plays, and going back to the power of group, to build those skills, and going back to the power of the group setting, build the skills in individual work, in family work, in phone check-ins, in a group setting, they could really develop a sense of self-concept and boundaries by just being in a group setting where there are basic group rules that we're all probably familiar with and mostly would agree with, and being able to learn from other people and how they've navigated healthy and unhealthy relationships with an emphasis on not just the unhealthy ones, but what do the healthy ones look like? Next slide, please. Okay. Negative cognitions. Okay. We really want youth to have accurate and helpful perceptions of themselves and relationships and the world. You know, a lot of times individuals may have learned to feel that they are only good for certain things, they are only valuable in certain ways, or that they're not valuable at all, which may have been one of the original vulnerabilities to trafficking. Okay. All or nothing, black and white thinking could be a very common thing. And with trust and relationships, that's very, very dangerous because the healthiest relationships are flawed. And it's kind of interesting because I had a conversation recently about how in our healthiest relationships and relationship dynamics, sometimes even the best parts of it are the flaws. So we're not trying to look for them to have a perfect sense of self or others because that's just going to lead to disappointment. We want to guide you to reframe their thoughts and their beliefs to have an accurate and fair and helpful perception of themselves. It's not helpful for me to think that whatever I do doesn't matter and I shouldn't be held responsible, right? So having them have the same belief that someone else could do whatever they want and not be responsible isn't helpful. I could rant about for an hour about these sorts of different ideas and beliefs that could be presented there, but ultimately we want them to be able to acknowledge the mistakes and disappointments that come with even healthy, positive relationships, and also it helps neutralize the stigma or difficulty talking about the unhealthy or exploitive or abusive relationships where people don't feel like they have to be all or nothing, it's all good or all bad. So much of life, especially in your early development, is in gray areas. And as I mentioned earlier, in muddy areas, that's the same thing for relationships. That's the same thing for trafficking, abusive, and exploitive relationships. That's also true for some of our healthiest relationships. There are gray areas and there are muddy parts. Okay. We want them to restructure these beliefs to be able to develop their self-concept within their relationships and their worth and efficacy within those relationships so they can have stronger relationships.
Yeah, so
And next slide.
that's really bridging there from relationships to kind of what do we do about that self-concept. Ricardo, can you walk us through this a little bit too?
Oh, I'm sorry. Um, this is a quote. So support youth to step into and truly live their full self. You can move forward feeling I'm going to use this experience as a source of knowledge and a resource for me when I go and become a nurse practitioner or the next most amazing attorney in our country or whatever that is. Okay. I wish there was an open format we could see what the audience thinks of that. But ultimately, we're talking about, having self-efficacy and how do we support self-efficacy, right? Can we go to the next slide, please? Okay.
Antonio, can you
Um, uh,
talk a bit, or well, actually, Ricardo, you want to say a couple of
oh,
things about this
yeah,
and
yeah,
we'll
yeah.
go with
I'm sorry.
Antonio?
I thought I had an extra slide in there. I apologize, everybody. So, one of the misconceptions that we have about trafficking is that it's constantly abusive 24/7. It's important to understand there's pockets of feeling good, important, valued, and these things we've already talked about. Again, and I think I could go through this quickly because I already talked about the muddiness and the ambiguousness of these things. We want the youth, in short, for us to have the curiosity and set up the tone for them to be able to share with us about their experiences. And we want them to have different experiences with us as the clinicians in our group settings and in their healthy relationships that are different from the trafficking and make them want to stay because they get something from the benefit without something being taken away from them. Because we want to build their sense of self-efficacy and how they relate to others in the healthiest way possible. Opportunities for having leadership, and this could involve pro-social activities that you recommend as a treatment plan or just in general, and any opportunity for the youth to feel valued, to build their sense of self and exploration, what they like, what they don't like, who they are, and build it for themselves and not for someone else who's trying to take advantage and exploit them.
And Antonio, can you add a little bit on to building up self-concept?
Yeah, I think, just to build on what Ricardo shared earlier about like empowerment and voice and choice, like every opportunity that we can to lead into that, whether that's, here's a menu of options, right? Of all presenting here's all of the different things that exist in this program and the ways that you can take part in them. Tell me what's of interest to you. Also inviting young people to share with their peers, right? Here are some of the various activities and taking them for tours, and showing them around the program. Really, meeting young people where they're at, finding out, about what it is that they're interested in, and then giving them a lot of choice and optionality to the extent possible, of the things that they can take part in. We've done things where, we've had a youth-led group where, we periodically where we invite young people to express the different kinds of topics and areas of interest. And then we do the important thing of following through, and building group activities and discussion topics around the things that they have specifically requested, so that they feel like they're invested, they have a part in shaping what the programming looks like, and they're more engaged and involved in their treatment. allowing them to, see and experience something different, right? That their exploiter is not the only person now in their life that could support them, that other forms of support, supportive relationships exist, really cultivating opportunities for those experiences to happen. Thinking about, what are some of the benefits, whether it's like a rush, from some of the trafficking and exploitative experiences that they've had. Are there other less harmful ways that they can, kind of recapture some of those same feelings, engaging in different exploration and experimentation to find out what those things could be. And so, different kinds of self-care activities, right, in that exploration, whether that's, I'm thinking of the range of things that young people have taken part in, from like trauma-informed yoga that is specialized for them, cooking classes and experiences, of course, like various kinds of arts and crafts, like other ways of moving their body that are producing endorphins, like, like skateboarding as a risky kind of rush building experience, as opposed to other things that could be more harmful. Music, fashion, watching makeup tutorials, right? Like, what are the things that calm and soothe them, that excite them, that are maybe reconnecting to past interests that they've had to leave behind, or, room to explore and build excitement about new things. On to the next slide. And then in terms of like development of future self, again, like the possibility modeling, giving access to and optionality. So this quote, be flexible in how you see your youth clients, give them permission to change and to see them as so much more than the traumas that they've experienced. One of the things for me is how my therapist has believed so much in my growth and ability to be a professional, that she's been able to hold that space. And this is where I think, one of the probably most amazing experiences that I've had professionally is, in being able to incorporate, folks with lived and living experience into this work, survivor leadership, mentorship experiences. Again, the power of groups, bringing young people into contact and into safe relationships with survivor leaders, with peer mentors who can serve as models. Who both, get it because they have been there, they understand the dynamics, the longing, the benefits and experiences of that world, and also have explored and are doing things beyond that, and are experiencing different kinds of, success and growth and excitement in their lives, who can also normalize that, it's not a linear path, that, normalize regret and longing, normalizing, maybe like backsliding, experiencing changes, that this is not a quest for perfection, that we are all imperfect and just doing our best to live our best lives. And I think also that shared experience, mutuality, is such a powerful experience. It's not something that I, as a social worker who is not a survivor, I'm not going to be able to replicate that level of understanding and mutuality. But we can connect those things and I can build on it. And the last thing I'll say about this is just really celebrating, the progress, those moments of, celebration, recognition, cheering on like the small successes. And I think also, again, this is not just things that we are doing like for and to young people, but involving young people in this process, right? These are, collaboratively developing, different kinds of celebrations and recognitions, inviting them to share and cheer their peers, and receiving that, so that they're not solely kind of dependent on us as yet another kind of adult authority figure in their life to be the source of that validation and recognition, but, creating opportunities for that to come from their community of peers, opportunities for that to come from their families, and also for them to be reciprocating that, right? So not just receiving, but also giving, and helping to build, healthier relationships in that way as well. And I'm wondering if anyone has anything else to add.
I mean, I think that's it's very inspiring to think about that potential for youth as they go forward, and to understand, that their experiences have been what they have been, but that doesn't define what their future is. And I think that's so important.
I get to, can I share some of I want to drive home some of those gold nuggets that Antonia and Ricardo have been talking about. So we really want to integrate psychoeducation, as Ricardo and then Antonia were talking about. We want to help youth to understand why they feel the way they do. In this world, we talk about, with trauma, if you can name it, you can tame it, right? If I can put words to it, I can respond to it and understand it. Having words and understanding of something changes our experience of it. And in our therapy space with youth, we can do a lot of work to help youth define boundaries, well, physical, financial, emotional. And I really appreciate some of the creative ways, that we talked about in order to do this in a creative, engaging, and age-appropriate way. And also, bite-sizing and doing this. Ricardo's talking about like boundaries don't have to be these massive conversations. They also happen in these small conversations, like expressing your needs about what movie to watch tonight, right? Like these are healthy, supporting youth in order to do that are the building blocks for these other things. We can also help youth notice and reframe these cognitive distortions or negative self-talk. As we talked about, this isn't and often isn't a cognitive restructure with a triangle and just saying a different thought. Often it's youth having these experiences that reinforce alternative beliefs, and that's what's most effective in helping to integrate them. And lastly, and most importantly, creating space for self-efficacy, letting youth lead, cultivating their specific interests and helping them to start to envision a future self that they actually feel connected to, right? Not that we envision, but they envision for themselves. And we really want to challenge ourselves to notice that this trauma work with youth who experience trafficking isn't just the talking about the trauma, right? It's these other components of it, and sometimes in our role as clinicians, our role is to be advocates around this as in our program and to help them understand this link. Antonia's talking about this, doing skateboarding. We're not just doing this because it's fun. We're talking about alternative, healthy thrill seeking in a developmentally accessible way. And so we can support our settings to try to help youth have access to the opportunities that build these positive domains and these aspects of self-concept and interpersonal relationships.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. We want to just, as we're wrapping up here, highlight a few resources that might be relevant to supporting healthy interpersonal relationships and positive self-concept for youth who've experienced trafficking. So I'll just share a few of those. These are resources that offer information and tools to help youth manage some of the common challenges about interpersonal relationships, especially dating, romantic relationships, and sexual relationships. So this one on the left, Break the Cycle, it talks about toxic relationships and it offers some resources on dating violence and getting into and being in and also ending relationships. So it's got some tips about information with research on dating violence, and then it's also got some tips for caregivers to support teens towards healthy relationships. So just some of those conversations, opening conversations with young people about their relationships and about what's feeling good and what's not feeling good. And then the one on the right, Love is Respect. It's from the National Dating Abuse Hotline. There's some resources there for teens who want to explore healthy relationships it's got some blog posts, it's got opinion pieces, it's got events for youth across the country, and they talk about different topics that are relevant, including things like consent and ending unhealthy relationships and setting boundaries. And then the resource in the middle is something that I think Jen had mentioned earlier. It's from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. It's a fact sheet on sexual health and trauma. None of these are specific to trafficking, but they're all really relevant to the issues that youth who've experienced trafficking will come across. So in particular, this one is talking about sexual health and concepts that are central to trafficking, like consent or non-exploitation. So when you've been used to a certain type of relationship, how do you relearn what feels comfortable and good to me? And how can I set limits and keep myself safe? There's also, folks mentioned some of these prevention curriculums. So I know Antonia mentioned that she and Ricardo are both trained in Not a Number. That's out of Love 146. My Life, My Choice also has a prevention curriculum. And these will talk about, they usually will incorporate some components about building healthy relationships and supporting youth self-esteem. So those might be helpful. And then this one's specific to trafficking. It's out of the Family and Youth Services Bureau. And it's a fact sheet looking at peer-to-peer recruitment. So that's especially in congregate care settings when we're looking at interpersonal relationships for youth who've experienced trafficking. There may be issues related to peer-to-peer recruitment. So it's got some strategies to address it, to prevent it, identify and intervene in peer-to-peer human trafficking recruitment. And specifically, they're focused on runaway and homeless youth settings. There's some useful information in there and just thinking about those concepts. And thank you all for joining us today. If you haven't already, please join our email list to stay aware of professional development opportunities available through the National Center on Child Trafficking. There's a QR code there for any of you who are not yet signed up. Please keep informed about what resources and events we have coming up. And I hope you all have a wonderful day. We look forward to seeing you again at upcoming events. Take care.